In the mid to late 90s, racing games were becoming incredibly popular, many of which were developed to give the player a realistic driving experience, and they were called driving simulators rather than driving games. In this video, we're going to explore the game that started a legacy which is still popular to this day. It raised the bar and set a new high standard for how a rally simulator could and should be made. This is the big breakdown of Colin McRae Rally. Colin McRae Rally is the first game in arguably the most popular rally game series of all time. It was developed and published by Codemasters for the PlayStation and PC, releasing in 1998 in Europe and then in 2000 in North America. Not many games could capture the essence of rally racing like Colin McRae Rally, but one thing that people may not be aware of is the pivotal role that the legend himself played in creating this iconic game. Colin McRae wasn't just a name slapped onto the game, he was an integral part of its development. His expertise and passion for rally racing became the cornerstone of the game's authenticity. The main mode in this game involves competing in the championship. The player will race in various locations around the world and experience a multitude of terrains, weather conditions and times of day to battle against in the hope of finishing with the fastest time. Speaking of the fastest time, they'll need to finish in the top 6 to qualify and race in the next country. There are 8 countries to compete in, all of which have 6 stages with various obstacles to overcome. The first country that the player will compete in is New Zealand, and the 6 stages that they'll race in here work well as an introduction to what the rest of the competition is going to throw at them. The stages here are made up of either gravel or wet mud, and the tracks are fairly wide. This works well because it gives the player room to get a feel for how their car handles, as well as an introduction to the various environmental factors which will affect them as they progress. The next country the player will visit is Greece, which has a very dry and rocky environment. Most of the tracks here are made up of dusty gravel, and the player will face many sharp turns as well as changes in elevation in this hilly part of the world. After Greece, the player will compete in Monte Carlo, and this is where the game turns the challenging aspect up a notch. Monte Carlo is a very technical course, mostly because, as you can see, it's made up of majoritively snow. The player can no longer just throw the car into a corner and hope for the best. These 6 stages require a bit more thought and use of the brake pedal. If the player does take a corner too quickly, they'll end up sliding straight into the snow. This can be a pain because the car moves very slowly to make its way back onto the track, wasting precious seconds. If snow wasn't already challenging enough, Monte Carlo is also home to the first night stage of the championship, although thankfully there doesn't seem to be much snow around on this stage. The next challenge comes from Australia, which seems to be set in the outback. The player will negotiate many tight and winding turns whilst trying their very best to avoid smashing into the many trees and shrubs that surround the track. The surfaces here are similar to those in Greece and are made up of dusty gravel. Next up is Sweden, and the difficulty aspect has once again increased. Not only is Sweden made up of snow, the tracks also have ice on them now, which means the player will need to battle against ice physics to keep control of the car. Ice is a lot less forgiving and a lot more slidier than snow. That paired with the narrower tracks to work with and the huge snowbanks surrounding the edges makes Sweden a very challenging course. The player is required to really plan every moment here and demonstrate a lot more patience than they may have done up until now. The next place the player will race in is Corsica, which, if you're wondering, is an island in the Mediterranean which is a part of France. The stages are set high up in the hills and feature tight, windy tarmac roads. Tarmac is a bit of a weird one in this game because it sounds like it shouldn't be too challenging to drive on, but in its own weird way, it kind of is. The car grips really well on tarmac surfaces, which poses a weird dilemma for the player. This is because up until now they've been solely racing on surfaces with very little grip, meaning they've grown accustomed to swinging the car into corners early and sliding around them. Due to the nature of tarmac in this game, the player won't want to turn into a corner too early or they'll end up crashing, once again wasting precious time. Next up is Indonesia, and the player will be mostly driving on tight muddy surfaces throughout this dense jungle whilst trying to avoid the surrounding tropical flora. They will also be driving on tracks made on these sandy beaches in Indonesia. Sand behaves a little bit like snow in the sense that if the player comes off the track, it's a slow and painful journey back. The final location in the championship is the United Kingdom. The stages here are made up of mostly snow, mud and tarmac. It's pretty easy to make a mistake around here if the player loses concentration for even just a moment. There's lots of tight turns, some of which lead through gates which aren't really visible up until the last second. The player won't be just battling against snow either. They'll need to make their way through a night stage and even one stage which is surrounded by fog. Once all of these locations have been completed, the player will be presented with the final standings. If they finished in the top 3, they'll be included in the final podium. There are 3 difficulties that the player can choose from when participating in the championship, all of which have their own set of rules and conditions. Novice difficulty is the easiest. The player is only required to race in the first 3 stages over 6 countries, and they will be up against 7 opponents rather than 15. The cars that are allowed to race in the Novice Championship are required to be 2-wheel drive only, and this includes the Volkswagen Golf, Seat Ibiza and the Skoda Felicia. The Intermediate Championship is the most commonly raced in and requires the player to participate in all 6 stages over all 8 countries against 15 opponents. Cars here are required to be 4-wheel drive, so the player has to choose between the Subaru Impreza, Mitsubishi Lancer, Ford Escort and the Toyota Corolla. The hardest difficulty is the Expert Championship, and this is unlocked when the player finishes first place in the Intermediate Championship. It has all of the same rules that are in the Intermediate one, except here a selection of both 2-wheel drive and 4-wheel drive cars can enter. The cars eligible are the Ford Escort Mark II, Ford RS 200, Lancia Delta Integrale and the Audi Quattro. These cars need to be unlocked as well before they can be used, and this is done by winning the various special stages in the championship on the lower difficulty. So, this game looks pretty tricky then. What things are in place to make the experience enjoyable or even just doable? To start with, the player has a co-driver sat next to them whose job is to provide them with information about upcoming obstacles. The co-driver, who is voiced by Colin McRae's co-driver, Nicky Grist, will let the player know which direction they need to turn next as well as how tight or open the bend is. They will also give information about various driving instructions and environmental hazards that are ahead. Another thing the player can do to improve their odds is tune their car before starting a race. They can do so in this menu, and each setting displays information explaining how it will affect the car and what's best suited for where. As the player drives through the various stages, the car itself will take a battering as it's pushed to its limits. This menu here shows a damage report and what parts need repairing. Repairing any of these parts costs the player up to 60 extra seconds, which is added onto their final time at the end of the location. Handling is one to watch in particular. If it gets really bad, the car will start to veer off to the side on its own, making it pretty much undrivable and abolishing any hope of finishing in a good position. If the player wants to brush up on their skills, they can do so in Rally School. There are 3 difficulties with various challenges that teach the player techniques for racing, cornering and really just how to play the game. Colin McRae himself lends his voice to this part of the game. The player is shown a video with McRae explaining how to complete a challenge. He then provides insights while the player is having a go at pulling it off for themselves. After a challenge has been completed, the player is scored on certain criteria, which results in a pass or a fail. There are 2 other game modes to choose from: Rally mode, which allows the player to race a number of stages in a single country, and Time Trial mode, which is just that, over a single stage. Time Trial mode also allows 2 players to go head to head against each other. That's about it for the first Colin McRae game, but just how significant was it? Well, in short, very. It was the first rally simulator to really capture the fine details of the sport and transform them into an enjoyable game. Codemasters had a very professional team working on the project, but they also had a very passionate and knowledgeable rally hero working alongside them as well. Colin McRae throughout the series wasn't just a name on the game's covers, He was the heartbeat behind a gaming revolution. His involvement in the game and the rest of the series infused the essence of true rally racing into every pixel and line of code. His expertise gained from conquering the most challenging terrains in real life became the guiding force in game development. The precise handling, the authenticity of tracks, and the adrenaline rush experienced by the player were all testament to McRae's commitment to realism. Unfortunately, in 2007, Colin McRae died in a helicopter crash along with his 5-year-old son and 2 family friends. Although he was taken from us too soon, his legacy continues. He will be forever known as a tireless advocate for authenticity in gaming, an eternal symbol of speed, and a beacon of passion for not just motorsport enthusiasts, but a whole community of gamers. A lot of people have very fond memories playing these games, in many cases finding themselves taking an interest in rally sport itself because of how much they just love these games. This couldn't have been done without the passion and expertise of one of the gaming industry's most influential legends, Colin McRae. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to give the video a thumbs up if you liked it, and please subscribe if you want to see more big breakdowns like this. We've got many more gaming stories to explore. Thanks again, hopefully see you on the next video.